topic today is the human skeleton as an object. As a commodity, a scientific object, a natural object, an artistic object, an artisanal object. So I'll talk about the emergence of the skeleton as a commodity, who owned skeletons and who used them, and who made them. So when I talk about a skeleton here, I mean a full articulated skeleton. Individual bones in this era carried a number of different meanings, particularly as relics. But bones that were not relics held little value and were often removed from cemeteries to charnel houses when the bodies of their former owners had sufficiently disintegrated. Individual bones were of course studied and illustrated by anatomists and artists, and there were a few full skeletal relics. Interestingly, these are mostly in the 18th century, and relics is a whole other topic, which I'm not going to get into. But the main purpose of the physical skeleton was its use as an anatomical study, whether for science or for art. The skeleton was the prize of anatomical study, and it was far more valuable than individual bones. So the human body became a commodity shortly after the first human dissections at the end of the 13th century, which were soon followed by the first recorded prosecution for body snatching in 1319. The human skeleton has a somewhat murkier history, if you can think of something murkier than body snatching. Although Galen had written a treatise on bones, it appears to have been unknown until the 16th century. And it was on bones and not on the skeleton, which Galen defined as the whole linked system of bones of the human frame, and something he had seen only a few times over his career. It did not instruct on making a skeleton, which Galen probably would not have been able to do. Various models and illustrations of the skeleton had existed from antiquity, but these were for symbolic rather than anatomical purposes. And here's a mosaic from Pompeii depicting a skeleton. The Satyricon of Petronius mentions an articulated silver skeleton that was placed on the table during Trimalchio's banquet as a reminder to let us live then while it goes well with us. And this is a bronze Roman skeleton. It's very small. It's 110 millimeters long. It's really tiny. A skeleton was part of the 5-figure series, popular in medieval anatomical illustration, but it was so schematic that it's difficult even to classify it as a skeleton. And I particularly like the kind of upside-down head at the top, which is a kind of way to represent 3 dimensions in this thing. Now, Katie Park has argued that Vesalius made the first articulated skeletons in the late 1530s. Certainly, the evidence for the existence of skeletons before the 16th century is ambiguous, based on texts and on a few illustrations. We have one of Vesalius' skeletons. Here it is. We don't have anyone else's. Nor do we have instructions for how to make a skeleton before Vesalius. Yet there is some evidence to suggest that Vesalius may not have been the first. The 14th century physician Guy de Chauliac mentions making an anatomy of bodies from whom the flesh had already been removed. And I'll talk more about this in a minute. A few early manuscript illustrations of skeletons seem to be based on more experience of the body than the 5 figures. They include, there's a pause. They include this image from around 1420, which Nancy Ceresi suggests may be based on an actual body, and pretty well-known Richard Halland broadside from 1493. According to Carl Sudhoff via Andrea Carlino, the Halland figure was based on this 1454 manuscript, although to me the resemblance is not exact, but anyways. And as Tilman knows, Hieronymus Brunswick's 1497 chirurgia referred to using quicklime to remove flesh from a corpse in order to reveal the bones. This was a standard technique, as Vesalius later detailed, in the construction of a skeleton. Brunswick's illustration of a skeleton has much in common with Halland's of 4 years earlier, but there are also significant differences, particularly in the shape of the skull and the somewhat improved articulation of his shoulder. So this kind of indicates to me that he was perhaps working from an actual skeleton. But as many of you know, using texts and illustrations to determine actual practices is fraught with difficulty, and I'm not sure how much weight I want to put on these few examples of pre-Vesalian skeletons. So before I get to the topic of who made skeletons and how they made them, let me first talk about their uses. Who owned skeletons and how were they used? There are three main uses of skeletons, apart from symbolic or religious ones, in medicine, art, and natural history. And these are loose and overlapping categories, as we'll see. Medical uses might seem the most obvious, but while knowledge of where the bones were in the body was important for surgery, it was much less important for physicians. And an articulated skeleton that showed the relationship among the bones to each other didn't necessarily show how they worked in a functioning body. Here we get into the relative roles and functions of anatomists and surgeons. Not all surgeons were anatomists, and not all anatomists were surgeons. Many anatomists, like Vesalius, were physicians, and there were many surgeons like Paracelsus, or later physicians like Thomas Sydenham, who believed dissection was of little use in understanding the body. Even to many surgeons, a general notion of the location of particular bones, such as this one provided by Hans van Gersdorff in 1517, was sufficient. Anatomical textbooks, which were mostly written by physicians, discuss bones and skeletons in the most anodyne terms. They employ Galen's metaphor of the bones as the foundation of a house. They were earthy in substance. They were evidence of divine planning. While a physician should learn about the bones and the skeleton as part of their education, the specific application of this knowledge remains quite vague. A science of osteology, the study of bones and their diseases and their comparative and developmental study, emerged beginning in the mid-16th century with works by Pierre Bellon and Volker Kreuter. This is a very famous image comparing human and bird bones from Bellon's work on birds from 1555. Developing more fully in the 17th century, this science of osteology led to increased interest in the study of the skeleton and a corresponding need for articulated skeletons. The French surgeon Barthélemy Cabrol probably coined the term osteology in the 1590s, but Volker Kreuter, who's a Dutch physician, is the key figure here. And this is an image of a fetal skeleton from a work of his from 1575. In the 1620s, Adrian van der Spiegel revisited Kreuter's work from the 1570s on skeletal development, and this was reprinted again in 1659. By the time Bibliotheca Anatomica, that monument to mechanistic anatomy, appeared in 1685, osteology was becoming established as a discipline, and later editions included more and more works on bones and skeletons, until by 1710 they occupied most of the first volume. I really love this title page. This is the 1685 title page, which has the human body being dissected, the animals kind of piled up at the base, they're going to get dissected later, and the niches with mostly with skeletons and also with a crochet there on the side. But it's just, there's so much going on here. I love doing it. So if skeletons only became important to medicine in the second half of the 17th century, what about natural history? Kreuter and Bellon illustrated human and animal skeletons in the mid-16th century, but their example was not taken up until later. Animal skeletons do not figure in the major works of 16th century natural history, and skeletons of any kind are conspicuously absent from the catalogs of cabinets of natural history until the mid-17th century, at least the ones I've looked at. They did show up in anatomy theaters, which functioned both as sites of dissection and as kind of quasi-cabinets. The skeletons that preside in illustrations over anatomy theaters from Vesalius to William Hunter serve both anatomical and symbolic roles. And this is obviously not a totally realistic depiction of this anatomy theater, but there are plenty of skeletons around. And there are images of this theater without people in it, and the skeletons are still there, both animal and human. In terms of the order of dissection, the vast majority of anatomical textbooks and atlases started with the skeleton, even though logically it would be the product of dissection rather than its beginning. Therefore, it would be necessary to have a skeleton already present in the dissection room as a reference. In the natural history cabinet, animal skeletons became as important as human. Anatomy and natural history collections mingled and merged in the new academies of the 1660s. And here for the first time we begin to see a marketplace for skeletons, human and animal, as objects. This might be an artifact of the times. We don't have newspaper advertising, for example, until the 1660s, and it only really takes off in the 1690s. But this seems to be when skeletons become commodities. For example, André Coulson, an eboniste or furniture maker, did taxidermy and made skeletons for the Paris Academy for many years. His counterpart with the Royal Society may have been Nathaniel Highmore, who curated the Society's collections. Private anatomy teachers, owners of cabinets, and artists created a market for anatomical specimens. Let me now briefly turn to artistic uses. Katie Park noted that artists began to study anatomy long before anatomists began seriously to study art. Leon Battista Alberti wrote in Della Pittura, but what he's saying is that you need to study the bones before you can really study the rest of the body. So that you kind of start with the bones, you clothe it really with the muscles and then with the skin, and that's how you really learn how to draw the human body. By the late 17th century, manuals on human anatomy for artists assumed that students would be able to examine a skeleton. Many manuals of the genre anatomy for artists appeared between 1550 and the 1830s. Here's one example from Heinrich Lautensack's work on proportion and perspective from 1564. Not all such manuals talk about skeletons, though. Two of the most prominent, from Odoardo Fioletti at the beginning of the 17th century and Gérard de Leclerc toward its end, don't talk about skeletons, even though they were both anatomical illustrators. Fioletti for Giulio Caserio, and this same image was then used in the works of Van den Spiegel a few years later. These title pages were often reused. And Leclerc for Govard Bidwell. Fioletti, like many of his contemporaries, looked toward classical sculpture as a model in his works for students. But by the end of the 17th century, the student of art, as well as the student of anatomy, had access to a skeleton to look at. François Poitevin and Roger Dupille wrote the 1668 Apogée d'Anatomie accommodée aux arts de peinture et de sculpture as a manual for the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture, which was founded in the 1660s. They began with a detailed description of the human skeleton with 3 plates, all of them copied from the Celius. And they concluded, one must not fail to examine all of this well on a real skeleton, and especially do not continue onto the muscles without knowing the bones perfectly well. Thus, again, students had access to a real skeleton, whether it was at the academy or owned by themselves. 75 years later, Edmé Bouchardon similarly began his L'anatomie nécessaire pour l'usage du dessin, and also noted that osteology is the basis of anatomy. But his engravings, rather than being based on the Celius, were taken from life or death in the form of the Academy's own skeleton. So we know by the 1730s, the Academy definitely had its own skeleton. The teaching of anatomy at the Academy, until the time of Jean-Joseph Sue in the 1770s, was based on skeletons and cadavers. William Hunter, who began to teach anatomy at the new Royal Academy of Art in London in 1768, used live models as well, and Sue began doing this also a few years later. But Hunter began his lectures with the bones, demonstrating them upon the skeleton. As we see here, here's the skeleton, there's the live body, and there is an crochet next to the live body. Therefore, by the 1660s at least, a skeleton was part of the training of an academic artist. Academies possessed their own skeletons, as did some students and artists. The 18th century British sculptor John Flaxman kept a skeleton in his studio. In his manual, Anatomical Studies of the Bones and Muscles for the Use of Artists, only published posthumously in 1833, was, says his biographer, clearly based on actual examples and not on ideal illustrations. Another use of skeletons fell between the artistic and the scientific. While cabinets increasingly opened to the public by the end of the 17th century, fairs and taverns exhibited all sorts of anatomical and other specimens from the 16th century onward, and coffee houses became particularly important sites from the second half of the 17th century. Skeletons, real or factitious, were among these. Let me give just one example. There are many. Exhibited at London's Southwark Fair in 1716 was a human skeleton, or the skeleton of a man, which by mechanical projection performs several very strange and surprising actions, also groans like a dying person, smokes a pipe of tobacco, and blows the candle out as naturally as if alive. And I have written about this elsewhere on my blog and other places. There are several ads about this in 1716 and 1717, and thank you to many newspapers, which allows you to find these things. So this marvel made the rounds of London for over a year. Now to the making. Collectors such as Hans Sloane purchased skeletons, models, and preserved body parts from various purveyors. Sloane's manuscript catalogs of his collection of Humana, which is now in the Library of the Natural History Museum in London, gives some clues about where he gets them, about provenance. Sloane purchased and was given specimens from his network of surgeons and physicians. We can see he has the skull of an Irishman brought from Ireland for medical use, the skull of an Indian taken from one of the caves in Jamaica where they used to be interred. These are the last three. The jawbone of the underside of the same. And he had agents in Jamaica, particularly a guy named Henry Barham, who would send him these things, who would find skulls in caves and send them to Sloane. But the one I'm particularly interested in, you can see number 14, the skeleton of a man made by Mr. Verrier of the body of a highwayman executed at Tyburn and bought by me. And so he purchased the body of, I think this indicates he purchased the body and then had someone make a skeleton of it. He would have purchased the body probably from the person being executed, because in England, you owned your own body. This was not true in France. In France, the executioner owned your body. But in England, he would have purchased it then from the man being executed. He would have given him money and said, I want your body after you're dead. And then he would get it. And then he commissioned someone to make a skeleton of it. Now, collections such as Sloane's were bought and sold frequently. William Hunter, for example, purchased many collections. And these collections then merged together, which makes provenance very hard to trace. There's a manuscript memo that notes Hunter's purchase of the anatomical preparations of a Dr. Sandys, which included materials from the surgeon William Bromfield, and among the items was an adult skeleton. And we're not sure if Bromfield or Sandys made it. So let me focus for the rest of my time on instructions for making skeletons. And then, if you're squeamish, this is the time to leave. And some examples of who actually made them. The Salies wrote the first known set of how-to instructions on constructing a skeleton, which comprised chapter 39 of book 1 of the 1543 De Fabrica. But the procedures had existed for quite a while. Brunswick talked about the use of quicklime, as I mentioned, and even earlier, Guy de Chauliac noted, we also make an anatomy of bodies dried in the sun, or consumed by the earth, or rendered in running or boiling water. And here, anatomy means the skeleton. Macerating in water, with or without lime, and drying in the sun were long-known methods of preparing bones, if not entire skeletons, either for transport or burial, or for use in teaching. Because think about the bodies of the Crusaders, particularly who had died abroad, there had to be some way to bring them back, and most commonly you brought the bones back, and not the entire body. So there were, people knew how to separate bones from flesh. The Salies first described the conventional method of preparing a skeleton, indicating that this had been done before, and he actually illustrates both methods in his initial letters. So on my right, your left, is the perforated box I'm going to talk about. As much flesh as possible was cut off the body without severing the joints or the ligaments, before it was put in a long perforated box covered with quicklime and sprinkled with water. After a week, the box was placed in a stream of running water, and the flesh would presumably fall off the bones and be washed away over a period of days. Then it was removed, further cleaned with a knife, and posed in the sun to dry in a particular position, held together by the ligaments. Vesalius described this method only to denigrate it as time-consuming, dirty, and difficult. Moreover, the blackened ligaments would cover the joints and other parts of interest. He then described in excruciating detail the proper way to separate bones from flesh. In his first line, which is one of my favorite lines of the book, you can get any kind of cadaver somewhere. Just find a body, just find it. And procurement of the cadaver is curiously missing from all accounts of making skeletons. Nobody tells you where to find a body, and I'll talk more about that at the end. The construction began first with dissection and then with boiling in a large and capacious cauldron of the kind women use for the preparation of lye over the fire. And you can see that on the right. It's kind of, these initial letters are quite small, so it's kind of hard to see the detail. But you can see that Pluto is pulling a skull out of this cauldron that's over the fire. His instructions assume considerable knowledge of the body. He boiled the bones for several hours, carefully covered by water at all times, regularly skimming off froth and fat. The bones of children, he said, take less time than adults. The object of the cooking is to clean the bones as thoroughly as it's done with the knife while eating. Therefore, one should pull out individual bones from the broth with tongs from time to time and clean them further with the hands or a knife. But this job should not be entrusted to a mere amateur. And here's his famous illustration of the tools of dissection. And I've written about the kitchen, and there's all these kitchen metaphors. I've written about the kitchen as a site of anatomical work, and culinary and anatomical knives are indeed quite similar. The cannibalistic language is unmistakable. The cleaned bones are then placed in more boiling water, removed, and carefully dried with a rough cloth, which removes the remaining bits. Bones should not be allowed to dry too much before the skeleton is assembled. The bones are not too dry. The shoemaker's awl that you can see on the right there may be used to punch holes for the copper wire used to string them together. And there's the wire, the coil of wire underneath. Although in the 1555 edition of De Rodrigo, Vesalius also described a bone drill that he had constructed. He recommended starting with the feet and working upward, the reverse of the usual head-to-toe order of dissection. An iron rod made to order supported the vertebra, and then the arms were assembled and wired to the trunk. These instructions were repeated with some variation for the next 2 centuries. But Vesalius seemed little concerned with aesthetics, with the whiteness of the bones. With characteristic macabre whimsy, he recommended posing the skeleton with a scythe or a pike or a javelin, and he suggested stringing the ear bones onto a nerve to make a necklace. His objection to the older quicklime method was partly aesthetic, in that the blackened ligaments were unsightly, but his main concern was that they obscured the joints. Yet boiling, as he recommended, would leave the bones brownish rather than white from all the dissolved fats and marrow, and drying them by the fire, as he instructed, rather than in the sun, would not bleach them at all. Later, whiteness became of critical importance. The great French anatomist Jean Riolon the Younger spent far more time on bones than on any other part of the body in his Schola Anatomica Nova of 1608, but he didn't provide detailed instruction on the construction of the skeleton until the publication of his anatomy textbook, Anthropographia, in its definitive 1626 edition. He seemed to have a skeleton available during his anatomy lectures, and he said that knowledge of how to construct a skeleton was essential for anatomists. Before him, Reoldo Colombo had also provided such instruction in his 1559 De Re Anatomica, but many other manuals did not. Colombo and Riolon wrote for physicians, but the German physician anatomist Michael Leiser provided by far the most detailed instructions in his 1653 work Cultor Anatomicus, the anatomical knife, and this is the English edition from 1740. Although he wrote in Latin, Leiser assumed far less knowledge than had Vesalius, beginning with quite basic information, including what kind of corpse was most suitable. The skeletons of infants, though highly desirable, serve more for ornament than real use, he said. Leiser detailed the division of the body into parts and how to extract the marrow, offering illustrations of the proper instruments. And this is the only illustration in the book. He doesn't have any pictures of bodies or bones. He added first step of soaking the bones and several changes of water to extract blood after removing the marrow and before boiling. This would help ensure the desirable whiteness. During the boiling, the water is to be skimmed clean of its nastiness, that the bones may be white. Young bodies needed less boiling than older ones. This, he said, even the common cooks are apprised of, because they daily find that old meat takes a longer time in boiling than young. Cleaning the bones was the job of an assistant, and unlike Vesalius, Leiser claimed that anyone who could cut his meat could do this, except for the head, which required a good osteologist with a careful and experienced hand, and specialized instruments. Leiser referred to his master, the Danish physician Simon Pauli, who had developed a method to make bones as white as the finest ivory. His method, first published in 1673, was reprinted in Bibliotheca Anatomica in 1685, and this is from the 1711 English translation. Pauli exposed bones to the bleaching effects of sunlight and added the chemical effects of snow and rain during the winter and spring. Certain salts and precipitation during this time were, he claimed, particularly efficacious. He advised constructing a kind of table or frame for the bones, with slates lying on a bed of sand, upon which the bones were to be placed. The chemical interactions among the slates, the rain, and the intermitting sunlight over a period of weeks or months produced the bleaching effects. If there was not enough natural rain, the anatomist must regularly sprinkle the bones with rainwater reserved for this purpose. And these frames should be placed on the roof. So, Leiser's and Pauli's instructions are often reprinted. Leiser's book went into 5 editions as well as translations, and often copied. In the 1740s, Alexander Monroe Primus called Cultura Anatomicus the book on the dissecting art, which has had the greatest character, and to this day is generally esteemed the most complete treatise on the subject. By the end of the 17th century, the 1697 Osteological treatise of the English surgeon Robert Baker reveals the increased commodification of the skeleton. Baker directed his instructions written in English toward absolute novices. Leiser had assumed less knowledge than had Vesalius, and Baker assumed only the names of the parts. He reminded his readers not to lose bones, how to repair bones they had inadvertently broken, and he spent 3 pages on the preparation of the corpse for boiling, explaining how to cut vertebrae apart and how to keep the finger bones together by putting the hand in a glove. He borrowed Pauli's recommendation of laying the skeleton on the roof to make it white, but he omitted the chemical explanations and apparatus. And we don't know who exactly attended Baker's surgery lectures, but 25 years later, the surgeon Nathaniel St. Andre offered lessons in constructing the skeleton to whomever could pay for them, and offered to make skeletons on demand. See, Mr. St. Andre will also give a private course of anatomy in which he will demonstrate the method of dissecting, preparing, mounting the skeletons, etc. The skeletons already bespoke will be ready to be delivered at the end of the public course. So you could order a skeleton and he would make it for you. So where he got the bodies, we don't know. By the 18th century, the value of skeletons made knowledge of their construction essential to anatomical instruction, at the same time as the growth of sensibility made this construction more problematic. So for the rest of my time today, I'd like to talk about 2 sets of manuscripts from the 18th century. Alexander Monroe Primus was professor of, I forgot this part. This is important, because this is about commodification. This is from 1748. This is a catalog of a library that is to be sold. And there's all these books, mainly on theology, and right at the bottom of the list, 2 skeletons. Just in case you want 2 skeletons with your books. Okay, sorry, I forgot that. So let me talk about Monroe Primus and William Hunter. Monroe was professor of anatomy at the University of Edinburgh's Medical School from its foundation in 1726 until he retired shortly before he died. His younger contemporary and fellow Scot William Hunter opened his private anatomy school at Great Windmill Street in London in 1746, and each attracted students from across Europe. Monro published an early book on osteology, but neither of them ever published his anatomical lectures. We have Monro's own copies of his lectures, which traveled to New Zealand with his descendants in the 19th century. So weirdly, the University of Otago in Dunedin, New Zealand, there are all these 18th century anatomical manuscripts. We don't have Hunter's lectures at all, but several sets of student notes survive. Monro wrote The Anatomy of the Human Bone soon after he assumed the professorship in 1726, and went through at least 12 editions by the end of the century, but it did not tell us how to make a skeleton. Monro wrote a manuscript treatise on the anatomical encheiresis, or manual part of anatomy, in 1747 for the use of his son Donald, and this had detailed instructions for making anatomical models and preparations, including skeletons. And Monro emphasized the central importance of bones for anatomy. And again, I'm not going to read all of this, but basically he says you need to have a skeleton. So knowledge of the bones is absolutely necessary for understanding the texture, connection, situation, and uses of the other parts. They are generally and ought always to be first demonstrated in a course of anatomy. Monro described two procedures for removing the flesh from the bones: boiling and simple maceration in cold water, in other words, soaking the corpse in a bathtub, basically. He recommended leaving some flesh on bones to be boiled to save them from being stained by smoke and the accidents of burning. Drilling holes in the ends of the bones before boiling allowed the marrow to escape more easily, as well as serving to help wire them together later. So everyone has a different way of proceeding in that. Because the marrow melted in boiling water and made the bones, quote, greasy and yellow, he advised thorough skimming. He claimed that using soap, potash, or lime in the boiling water to ensure whiteness weakened the bones, so he didn't do that. He actually preferred maceration to boiling, although it took much longer and resulted in what he called ungrateful corruption of the flesh, put it mildly. It left the bones far whiter because the marrow was fixed rather than melted, and the blood washed off rather than staining the bones. Maceration required that the water be changed every day or two, and the corrupted soft parts gradually removed by hand. This was obviously an extremely unpleasant task, and one that made boiling preferable to most anatomists. Not that boiling was all that much fun, but it's better than kind of yellow. Whiteness was critically important to Monro. Whiteness and smoothness contribute greatly to the beauty of the preparations of bones, which has made anatomists value themselves on excelling in this sort of preparation. And he's among the most explicit in valuing these aesthetic qualities of the skeleton. Monro's income, like Hunter's, came from student fees, and the number of his students steadily increased each year from the beginnings of the medical school in 1726 until his retirement 40 years later. In an increasingly competitive market among independent anatomy teachers in London, Edinburgh, and Paris, Monro realized early that the quantity and quality of his preparations, including skeletons, could attract students. He noted that anatomists generally have a collection of skeletons, so at this point, not just one, but a whole collection. Adding they serve both for show and for demonstrating the bones on. He repeated Pelder's instructions on whitening, but like Baker, ignored the chemical theorizing. But he also pointed out that rooftops in the winter, particularly in notoriously smoky cities like London or Edinburgh, would be a poor place to preserve whiteness. They would get all sooty. Despite Leiser's disparaging remark on the value of fetal skeletons, Monro included detailed instructions on their preparation that were also applicable to very small animals. Here he especially recommended maceration over boiling to preserve the ligaments, thereby making a natural as opposed to an artificial skeleton that would be connected with wire. Although Vesalius had recommended the corpse of someone who had died of a wasting disease as the ideal subject for a skeleton, Monro thought that a healthy adult between the ages of 30 and 40 was the best for a beautiful and durable skeleton. Old bones were too brittle. But for teaching purposes, a variety of ages and constitutions was desirable. Now, William Hunter moved from his native Scotland to London in the late 1730s and apprenticed himself to a Scottish physician and naturalist named James Douglas. Like his mentor, Hunter made a reputation as a man midwife and accoucheur, and a teacher of anatomy, and taught at a school at Great Midwell Street in London, as I said, from 1746 until 1783. Some 2 centuries after Vesalius, remarkably little had changed in the acquisition of bodies and the slightly disreputable reputation of the anatomist as a result. So here's an illustration from De Fabrica of basically body snatching of the putti, who are hauling the body out of a grave. And there's a very similar illustration here. Well, so here is a caricature from 1773, the anatomist overtaken by the watch, and the guy who's running off is a portrait of William Hunter. So, and there's carrying off Miss Something in a hamper. There's Miss Something in a hamper. There's the beetle, and there's the watch, who are trying to catch Dr. Hunter, who is running away, leaving the body behind. Based on his career as a man midwife, Hunter built a persona of a gentleman connoisseur and collector. But behind the closed doors of his anatomy school, he demonstrated what he called to his students a kind of necessary inhumanity. Hunter defined anatomy not only as dissection, but also as a number of other operations. Injecting, macerating, corroding, boiling, distilling, in a word, every operation by which we endeavor to discover the structure and use of any part of the body is anatomical. All parts but the bones putrefy, said Hunter, and skeletons were critical to the anatomist's repertoire. A skeleton is much preferable to figures, that is pictures, of bones, which are at the best but idle. Hunter advised each of his students to have a skeleton for his own use, as well as several skulls. Like Monroe, he asserted that a natural skeleton could be made only with very young subjects, but he was even more restrictive in his criteria for an adult subject, claiming, "We never make use of a subject under 25 or above 35 years of age." Adult skeletons were most commonly prepared by boiling the body after first steeping to remove the blood. Hunter also recommended maceration and bleaching to complete the preparation. Regardless of its usefulness, a natural fetal skeleton was a highly prized commodity. Sloane had several in his collection, as did Hunter. Hunter spent some time in his lectures detailing their construction. The subject should be from a fetus 9 months to a child 5 years old. Several procedures were possible. Putrefaction from soaking in water was probably the easiest, if the most unpleasant. But there was a danger that the ligaments would rot as well. If you didn't soak the corpse too long, you have a fine small skeleton to expose to maggots or insects. Hunter continued, another method besides putrefying is this: if you want the bones to be white, inject by the aorta for 2 or 3 hours, which will return by the veins, and then expose them to maggots. We don't know what he injected. For those with more time, Hunter recommended burying the boxed body in an anthill. But he commented, the animal that excels them all in preparing skeletons is this which by Linnaeus is called the dormouse. A kind of necessary inhumanity seems required, and certainly enforced the general moral unease surrounding human dissection. Neither Monroe nor Hunter commented on the acquisition of bodies. And this is kind of wonderful sketch by Thomas Rowlandson of Hunter's anatomy theater anatomy school, later made into a lithograph. And it just kind of shows the sort of casualness almost of this. There's a list on the wall of prices for corpses. There's, the bodies are just kind of tossed around. You know, there's one guy in the corner there, the body on the floor, there's one there. And just kind of this, disrespect for the human body. So to conclude, skeletons were important commodities in early modern Europe, like we have shown. As a natural object that nonetheless required assembly, their construction included considerations of aesthetics. They also required a certain level of expertise. Some of the documents I've discussed today imply that this expertise could be learned from books, but I think most would have agreed with Robert Baker, who stated that the forming of a skeleton cannot be so well expressed in writing as by often working and seeing it done. Making a skeleton was a craft that, unlike most other crafts, carried a weight of moral responsibility and even opprobrium. its material was human bodies that were almost always acquired illicitly, if not illegally. It was not actually illegal to steal a body, but most people thought it was kind of not cool. But it was not actually illegal because a dead body didn't belong to anybody. It was not considered property. Vesalius dealt with the discomfort of his readers by making jokes and kitchen metaphors, as did Lyser. Operating under a different moral regime in the 18th century, William Hunter acknowledged the necessary inhumanity of dissection while offering really cringe-inducing details, some of which I'm giving you. And I wonder even if he and Monroe exercised a form of self-censorship by never publishing their lectures, because neither could. So, I want to close with yet another caricature of William Hunter. He was very much caricatured. This is from 1782. This is the resurrection or an internal view of the museum in Windmill Street on the last day when all the corpses come back to chastise or otherwise discuss what happened to my leg to William Hunter. So I feel I've only touched the surface of an increasingly deep and complex topic, and I welcome panelists' comments and your questions. Thank you for your attention. Okay, there's yours.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Anita, for your fascinating paper. I learned a lot, and I have many questions. And thank you, Heidi, and to the other organizers for inviting me to comment. Anita has, as Heidi detailed, spent most of her scholarly career in the history of science investigating the interactions of humans and animals, mostly within a natural historical and natural scientific context in early modern Europe. Her last two books focused on experiments with humans and animals between 1500 and 1800, and these experiments included dissection of living and dead animals and humans. Her paper tonight turned to the practical side of anatomical teaching and collecting. How were skeletons sourced and produced for artists' academies, anatomy teachers, collectors' cabinets? Her paper is about the commodification of the human body and the human skeleton, and she traces the ways in which collectors, artists, physicians, anatomy theaters, and universities created a market for articulated skeletons. Now, we don't really think very much about the trade that is this market in specimens of which skeletons and bodies were a part. Human, animal, mineral, vegetable specimens that the new science and other kinds of practices at the time, including entertainment, engendered. Or rather, we have learned much in the history of science about the circulation of information and a fair amount about the circulation of natural things among the members of the Republic of Letters, that is, in correspondence, but not enough about the commercial market for natural specimens. And no doubt this market for bodies and bones somewhat overlapped with that for horses, for birds of all kinds destined for noble and patrician collections, for exotic animals destined for menageries, and other kinds of living things, humans and animals, for a different realm of society. It seems that records of trade fairs, inventories of shops, perhaps could shed some light on this subject. Of course, we have all of the evidence of collections, inventories of collections and cabinets, but until the 18th century, as Anita pointed out, we don't know very much about the provenance of these objects, about the objects within these cabinets and collections. So the trade in skeletons that you lay out here very interestingly could be set within a larger context of the marketplace and the commodification of other natural things at the time. And that would be a really interesting thing to know about, like how was it ever compared to the trade, etc. Now, her paper is not just about the commodification of the skeleton, but also about making skeletons, and this is where I got really excited. And it's in this section that she describes the processes of rendering, bleaching the bones, and reconnecting them. She notes the moral opprobrium that attached to the process and the ambivalence with which some physicians engaged in it. Now, she makes several important points about making of skeletons and that are generally relevant to experiential practices of the time, and that's where my where I'm going to focus for the rest of this response and where my questions lie. So the first point you make, which is a really good one, and you've written on it in other contexts also, is the close proximity of kitchens and artisanal workshops. So the use of the same tools, knives, vessels for producing cleaned bones, probably also as for rendering fat and making soup. And I wanted to know more about, for example, the butchers, who must have been essential collaborators with anatomists, even if for only the tools, the knives and the saws. I wanted to know more about the tools, and I know you've worked on tools also, and where did they get cauldrons that were large enough, or were skeletons put in piece by piece? So you can see that I wanted more grisly details. I began to think about all of the boiling as I was reading, the boiling and rendering that must have been done for soap making and other processes. And I really wished it were possible to lay out around this interesting story of skeletons that you've given us, to lay out the whole landscape of slaughter, butchery, and rendering of animal parts into useful components. And I'll just make one note about bones. It wasn't so much human bones, although I bet they were used sometimes also, but animal bones were used, for example, bone ash, which was very necessary for many industrial processes, especially crucible making and casting. And, you know, one does need to know how were they collected and cleaned, and were there any overlaps with the trade in skeletons. So again, important context that would give us the landscape of this trade in skeletons. Another wonderful point that you make is just the amount of essential information that's left out of written accounts, although it increasingly appears into the late 17th and 18th century. For example, where the bodies came from. Now that's maybe obvious that people don't want to talk about where the bodies came from. But also how to bleach the bones, details about how to articulate the skeleton. And I love the detail about the glove, because, you know, I've always wondered, how do you humans have 200 plus bones, and some of them are very small, and how do you keep them all together during the boiling process? Because actually, if you left the ligaments on, right, you couldn't then shape, and they dried, you couldn't shape the skeleton. So, you know, I just imagine, didn't you end up with a cauldron full of, 200 bones? And how did you ever sort them out? And it seems to me that there's a great amount of complexity which is left out, in the written sources. And that's typical of sources about the kind of experiential knowledge, not just because it's a grisly subject or engenders a lot of moral opprobrium, but also just because it's really hard to write all those things down. Anita, in her paper, also notes the inefficiency and inefficacy of writing and text to transmit these practices and hand skills, quoting Robert Baker that the forming of a skeleton cannot be so well expressed in writing as by often working and seeing it done. This is a very, very familiar theme in craft, and I'm getting going in the right direction here. Go anywhere. Oh, wait, that's because I'm pushing the wrong button. This is a familiar theme in craft, including less grisly subjects, like Nicholas Hilliard's, the beautiful miniature portrait painter, the beautiful objects. He also says exactly the same thing. In light of all of these points, my first question and broadest question is, did you try these instructions, and even just the ones for bleaching the bones? Would in fact trials and reconstruction provide further evidence for these lacunae, and give you some insight into really the best methods for bleaching. And I ask because, as some of you may know, I direct the Making and Knowing project, which operates on the premise that practical processes of the past usually cannot be understood from written sources or extant artifacts alone, but rather it's usually necessary to try to reconstruct these processes in order to fully understand the written sources. We reconstruct processes for objects that might have formed the contents of a collection of the sort that might have contained skeletons later in the period. This is a 16th century manuscript, an anonymous collection of mainly technical recipes. It's in French, and as I said, might have formed the contents of a collection. Our reconstructions are carried out in laboratory seminars, in a chemistry laboratory in Chandler on the Columbia campus, and we have, by the way, rendered fat and boiled down bovine bones to make bone ash. And actually, they didn't come out brown. They came out quite white, and they sounded, when you touch them, just like porcelain. They ring like porcelain. So we learned very interesting things about this, which I'm sure are not mentioned in any of your texts. But it did make me wonder why our bones, even though it was an extremely messy, smelly, and long process of boiling down those bones, why they came out so white. And that was with no bleaching. I was especially interested in your paper tonight because, fortuitously enough, we focused this last year in the Making and Knowing project on what we called vernacular natural history. Unlike the formal, scholarly, and textual field of natural history, which you mainly dealt with, this manuscript that we're working on contains various recipes that can be seen as practical, useful, or vernacular natural history, such as recipes for cultivation of various useful plants, such as silkworms and animals, the catching, keeping, feeding, and killing of animals for life casting, like this, and various methods of preservation, including for flowers dried in sand, and for animals dried in the oven, which must be some of the same processes that are mentioned early on for drying a body. I'll just end with one more example. These are some of the processes that produced this mouse taxidermy, or they're dried. They're not really taxidermy. There's nothing except drying that affects the preservation. But you can see both the methods that are used here, as well as in red you can see the use that it would probably, that was probably intended for these preserved animals, because you can make a hybrid monster, not an unfamiliar part of these kinds of collections in the late 16th century. So I just end with one more example. And this is part of the baking process, which is the secret, which we had an expert maker, a taxidermist, come in who helped us with these things and helped us source the animals ethically. I just mentioned that. So the trick to this, which she had no idea about and hadn't, thought definitely would not work, is hanging them upside down. And they really come out with this quite realistic pose. I mean, realistic in a certain kind of dramatic, theatrical way. You will be able to judge for yourself by the end of this seminar. And so hanging them upside down, lots of drying, then putting on the wings, then I'll just end with this folio 120V, in which he does actually mention an anatomie, in which he says, but you can see the top heading up there in the Roman script anatomie, and that says, you must skin the animal, it's only 2 lines, you must skin the animal and boil it, or better, skin it and put it into good quicklime. So, that made me wonder, and you do have some of the early writers that you quote, that made me wonder, what does really anatomy mean here? What is the aim and conception of anatomy if it's so different than we think of a dissection, right? And my first instinct was to say, well, this is practical use of that term. How did it come to be a dissection? How did it come to be a dissection? So we really go from an object, the skeleton, to a process, the dissection. And I don't know whether this is because the aim of this vernacular text is to produce objects, and then what does that say about the kind of commodification that you're interested in, or whether in fact it's a French usage, although I just looked in the 1611 Cotgrave's French-English dictionary and it says anatomy means a dissection. So obviously some people in France by the early 17th century thought it was a process, not an object. Okay, so that's my first kind of detailed question for you. But then I also wonder if you could say a little bit more about the marketplace of flora and faunal specimens in general, and the landscape of slaughter, butchery, and rendering in this period. How do you render a skeleton, and did you try it?
So do you want to take just a couple of minutes to answer some of the things Pamela brought up, and then we can start the vernacular?
Yeah, so as far as the meaning of anatomy, in the 18th century, they're still talking about a skeleton as a mere anatomy. So there are references in newspaper articles when you're talking about people starving, that they were reduced to a mere anatomy, meaning the skeleton. And I'm actually translating the encyclopedia article on anatomy, which is enormous. It's 37,000 words. And I haven't got to the point where they talk about that, but I bet they will. So yeah, that's a really good question. I don't understand that either. As far as slaughtering, no, I haven't tried it. And I thought of trying to make a skeleton out of like roadkill or something, and I think probably my husband would leave me if I did that, but I might still try it. So, but in terms of the relationship of anatomists to butchers, I talk a little bit about this actually in my book, in terms of Duvernay, who was the anatomist for the Paris Academy of Sciences, but he was also, did most of his work at the Jardin des Plantes at the what's now the Paris Museum of Natural History. And he did demonstrations on animal body parts. He had a relationship with a butcher in the Quartier Saint-Victor, which is where the garden was. There, in his accounts, he has accounts of buying things from the butcher, paying someone to carry off the viscera and bury it. So, I mean, there was definitely a relationship with the butchers. In that, at least you can trace that through the accounts. So he's using animals then to demonstrate techniques he then uses in human dissection. So that's absolutely clear. In terms of, and I mean, Vesalius actually says, the cauldron, such as women use for boiling wine. So it's, these big household cauldrons that you would use for things like making soap, for boiling laundry, presumably for those kinds of things. So there were these big cauldrons did exist. And again, it's this really household kind of language, which I find really fascinating. This kind of kitchen, the eating metaphors, the knives, that it's very much kind of kitchenware.
Although that's typical of craft.
Yeah, and
writing
just,
in general.
and the the kind of cannibalistic overtones, which I find really interesting. That's kind of it's like eating meat. It's like if you know how to carve, you can do you can take the flesh off the bone. It's really easy to do. And it's kind of old meat. Every cook knows that old meat takes longer to boil than young meat, and this sort of thing. So it's kind of, and I kind of think, I mean, that's a practical instruction, but it also, I really do think it's to kind of lighten up the mood in the dissection room. That it's like, oh yeah, it's just like cooking, ha ha ha. So because it's so gruesome. I mean, even if you're expecting to do this, it's pretty gruesome when you think about it. You know, cutting of a body, putting it in a cauldron, seeing, you know, hair and skin floating to the top, fingernails, whatever, and you have to skin them off, and it's like, wow. So it would be pretty gruesome. And I think it's like, oh yeah, it's just like eating. So, and Vasilius particularly is extremely whimsical in these things, which I find kind of a little off-putting, but anyways. So, yeah, so definitely butchering it and all of that is definitely part of it, and the same kinds of skills, certainly. In terms of the marketplace, I wish I knew more about that. I mean, there is certainly a market for animals, for live animals. Louise Robbins has a great book on the animal trade in 18th century Paris. Sloane's catalogs are really good for all of this. They're voluminous.
Oh, by the way, I wanted, excuse me, but Sloane's catalog, which said the body was 3 pounds, 4, 6, that seems expensive for the 16th century.
It is expensive, yeah.
It was expensive, but I wanted to ask a question on exactly this point. But to me, I felt disappointingly cheap. I mean,
well, yeah.
Because, I mean,
Yeah.
you're interested in trying to sell copies of the Osteology, which are the unsuccessful guineas each. So that they're individual copies of the book,
Yeah.
which could go for more money than that. It was $800 or something.
Yeah. So, no, I thought 3 pounds is a lot, but it's and it's not clear to me if that's what he paid for the body or what he paid the guy to make it. I mean, it's an annoyingly cryptic entry. And most of the time he doesn't put prices down. So I thought it was very interesting that he actually put the price for this. That he had done this transaction himself. It wasn't some, one of his guys out in the field bringing in things. So, yeah, it's, I don't know.
But I mean, how does it compare to the prices?
When skeletons are like advertised, it's all over the place. It's anywhere from, 2 pounds to 20 pounds to 100 pounds. It's kind of what the market will bear. And I haven't gotten into that as much as I would like to. I think I have to do a lot more digging in kind of advertisements and things like that. And I'm not, because people who collect these things, I haven't found like, oh, here's an account book that tells me exactly what he paid for these things. It's kind of, I mean, with William Hunter, there are kind of scattered memoranda, but then his whole collection was cataloged by his assistant, and so he didn't put all that stuff in. He just he didn't say, oh, and we got this from so and so, and it costs this much. So I'm starting to look at auction catalogs. But it's really hard to figure out which one actually has this in it, because the descriptions are like natural history, natural objects, and it turns out it's not relevant at all, or it's like, an elephant foot or something. So that I'm trying to figure out a good way to get into that, and I haven't found